This is The Bottom Line, a show designed to help Australian businesses succeed. On the show, you'll hear from leading Australian business owners as they share the lessons they've learned building their companies. You'll learn from their successes as well as some of the challenges they faced along the way. We also talk to experts from a range of fields who share specialised techniques you can use to improve your business. I'm your host, Savan Tuna, and I'm a director at Alexander Spencer, and I'm really passionate about helping Australian businesses succeed. Leasing commercial premises, it is damn scary. We went through it recently at Alexander Spencer. We finally got there, but we had help. Christopher Goodwin from Goodwin Property Advisory took us through the journey. He helped us source the offices, we went through the inspection process, and we finally picked the one we wanted. He helped us negotiate to get the best deal, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without him. Today, Chris joins us on the show, where he'll share all the tricks and all the tips in making sure that when it's your turn, you get the best premises at the best price for your business. Let's jump in. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on The Bottom Line today.
It's a privilege to be talking to you, Seven. Really happy.
We've been talking a lot for a while. We haven't spoken for a few months because you did help us with a few things. But before we get into that, for those that don't know you well, can you tell us a little about yourself?
I am a property consultant. I've been in the business now for too many years to talk about, but basically I was a director at Knight Frank Real Estate in Melbourne for 12 years, and then I set up my own consultancy business 12 years ago, specialising in provision of advice to tenants of commercial and industrial premises. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years. I don't act for landlords, so I get involved where businesses don't have their own internal expertise in terms of property, and they've got an event such as a lease coming to an end, or they're looking to move or contract. They don't have that internal expertise, so they get someone like myself to get involved in that process and hold their hand from start to beginning. And I was just looking at this. We started back in January 2022. So sometimes it can be a quick process, other times longer. And with Alexander Spencer, you were very fortunate in that there was no pressure to move. And I know you want to change the culture of your business. And so you want to make sure that the ultimate decision you made was the right one. And I think you've certainly done that.
And I'd love to share that story very quickly. So Chris was referred to our firm by a very close friend of mine that we know both well. He's actually been on the podcast, Paul Burness from Worrells, and you helped them to find some premises and help them with moving a few times. And yeah, in January 22, I can't believe that's when I first reached out to you, and it was an amazing process. So we're going to dive deep into office premises, factories, and all the things that you do for tenants. So maybe go a little bit deeper to set the scene for us. So it's Goodwin Property Advisory Proprietary Limited is your company. When we last spoke, you said that this could potentially be your last year and you are looking at retirement. So I feel like this podcast is a perfect timing to give a little bit back to the business community that you've been so well looked after over the years. But just let's dive into the services a bit. You touched a little bit on that. So you mainly work with tenants. Go deeper into the service offerings that you've done over the last few years.
Yeah, I have worked for tenants, but I've got involved with owners. I've acted for investors in buying commercial grade investments, but predominantly it is working for tenants, mainly up and down the eastern seaboard. So it is a situation of being called in when they have got a leasing event and they're not sure as to what they want to do. So I'm a bit of a sounding board. I can be very objective about the process in terms of what they do with their premises. So I get involved in very early stages in guiding them through that process. And it might be a lease renewal. They might want to renew their lease for a further term, or they might be fed up with where they are and they want to expand and move to new premises, or they might want to contract. And it's really going through that process and sort of setting out stages as to what they should be doing. It's a very collaborative process, particularly with Alexander Spencer. I know there's quite a lot of stakeholders involved in coming to the ultimate decision as to what you wanted to do. But this is what companies need to do. You've got to get all your ducks in a row before you set off on this journey. And you certainly did that with advice from myself, and other people like designers got involved in that process. So I do other things as well. So it's sort of where people have got issues, general issues with their lease or the landlord's been difficult. We had that particularly through COVID with rental relief and things like that. So I got involved with that. But it is specific. My advice is specifically targeted to tenants and not landlords. So I try to retain some sort of independence when negotiating for tenants, so there's no conflict at the end of the day.
That is exactly the next lot of questions I want to go through is negotiating. You were so good in the negotiating that we did on our premises. Like I said, without you, we would not have been able to not only find the premises because you helped us source it, but you also helped negotiate. And I want to talk about negotiating. So for Australian businesses entering a new lease agreement, what are some key steps that you should take well in advance of negotiations to strengthen their position?
I think that it is important that the organisation in question works out exactly first what it is they want. So you've got to refine your requirement. So I think the first things first, you've got to work out what your needs are in terms of amount of space, type of space, location, things like that. Then you've got to really work out a budget, what the business can afford, and also not in terms of your annual outgoings, but also in terms of capex, in terms of the move. I think certain companies have aspirations as to the type of accommodation and standard fit out they want. When push comes to shove, they find out that they can't actually afford it. And I think some businesses wrongly go about trying to save as much money on their accommodation as they can. They look for premises with existing fit outs, and maybe they should be thinking about going for an A grade building when they go for a B grade building. And it can, at the end of the day, be a false economy, because what you're doing at the end of the day is you're providing an environment for your staff to work in. And in order to attract good staff, you have to have an attractive accommodation. And we've certainly seen with tenants nowadays, particularly with what's happened with COVID, there is a definite flight to quality. Companies are looking to lease better quality. What I term, when I talk about better quality, I'm talking about A grade and premium grade premises, where things like lift services, air conditioning, natural ventilation, things like that are very important to their employees, particularly after the advent of COVID. So those sort of things have to be worked out first. And it's no good starting the race to find new premises until you've actually got a consensus amongst your directors and managers as to what that space needs to provide over the next course of the next 5-10 years. So I think it's important to do that. Otherwise, you might as well not bother. It's sort of, you've got to work these things out first. And if you don't, it can get expensive. And also, you've got to realise that when you decide to go down this route, Seven, you've spent a lot of time doing this, but it is a big distraction. And therefore, if you can get assistance to help you in this process, in the property negotiations and also the design process, it's going to save you a bit of time and money at the end of the day. So I think it's important to have good people on board who you can trust and have a professional approach. Just a little bit about myself. I am a chartered surveyor, which is an international qualification. I think there's 60,000 chartered surveyors in the world. And that is an organisation that ensures the professional conduct of the members. So it is particularly focuses on ethics and things like conflict of interest. So if I do the wrong thing, I'll get struck off. I think chartered accountants and CPA, they probably have the same sort of controls to the process. So if you are going down this route, it's important you have someone who is qualified. They might be a chartered surveyor. They might be, I'm also a licensed real estate agent. So I'm a licensed real estate agent as well, with experience in office leasing. And make sure you get to bed with the right advisor. And I also think having the design input in terms of helping you plan your space and what it's going to look like, to make sure that when you find the office space, you can fit everyone in an efficient manner. And that comes back to what we're finding now after COVID, a lot of changes in how people work practices, a lot of people working from home these days. So you've got to build that into your calculations and how you accommodate that, part-time work. So it might mean you don't need so much space, but you've got to work that out. Other things like working out meeting rooms. How many meeting rooms do you need? Are they going to be properly utilised? Density of desking. There was a time when density of desking was going down to, sort of one person per 8-9 square metres. With COVID, social spacing is now important. So people need more space between their desks, things like that. So that is going to affect the amount of space you need at the end of the day. So all these things all come together to help you save money at the end of the day if you do the proper planning in the first place.
Now, we found the right place. That was great advice that you went through, and tick, 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 we've gone through that. It's time to negotiate. Tell us how that process works and how do you engage in a negotiation?
Yeah, I think it's important throughout the process to ensure there's an element of competition all along. It's like buying a house. If you walk in and say, "Oh, this is lovely, it's just what we want," well, you don't do that. You make sure that you've got a couple of options up your sleeve, so there is a competitive element to it. I think also in terms of negotiations, having a good understanding of the market and rental levels and incentives, you need to have that in the back of your mind all along. So in terms of actual negotiations, you're dealing with real estate agents, and these guys go out with a property requirement to the market, and they'll throw anything at you that has the smallest possibility of being acceptable. So you've really got to filter that all out and come down to maybe a handful of properties, 3 or 4, and that's when the competitive element starts to occur. I've been in industry now in Australia for over 23 years, predominantly in the office market. So it's a very small industry. And so you get to know all the different players. And a lot of these agents will, if you push them, because the relationships you've built up with them, they tend to be a bit more forthcoming in terms of the information they're going to provide you as to where the deal is going to sit at the end of the day, which can save you a lot of time. And you've got to recognise that they want to do a deal, but you've also got to look at the various options. We find the market in terms of rents over the last 5 years, they haven't increased substantially, but they haven't fallen. But what has happened is the incentives increased. So when negotiating, you realise there's probably going to be a little bit of margin in terms of the rents being quoted. So there's going to be a bit of fat in that. But where the most amount of fat is at the moment is incentives, and it's negotiating those incentives and knowing how far you can push them. And I think you've always got to push them to the extreme, then come back. And so I think I certainly find the relationship I have with agents has helped in that process. And if people are being honest, whether they're giving you the true picture of where the deal's going to end up. And I think also I found, certainly with our negotiation, there were certain issues where they certainly kicked back, and I know they were very important to you, such issues as we knew that ground floor reception was going to be finished, but we were quite adamant that we needed some compensation for that, and they weren't prepared to do that. But I think we stuck to our knitting there, and we got it at the end of the day. So it's really knowing where there's possibility for some sort of give in terms of the negotiations. And also at the end of the day, you've got to realise in terms of the negotiations, you've got to win the war, not the individual battles. So there's some points which are going to be, we can live with that, it's not important, and not dwell on those and move on to those issues that really are important to you in terms of things like options and lease term and dollar. Make good is also important, things like that, and not get too caught up in the minutiae of the negotiations and just focus on what is important, what's not. Otherwise, you can end up going round in circles. And I think also some clients, I'm not saying you sell them, they tend to be in their bonnet about what is important and what's not. And what I end up doing is basically saying to them, I'm being very objective here. These issues in the scheme of things aren't that important, and trying to educate them in terms of what a good deal is going to look like at the end of the day. So you get a good result.
You've given us a bit of a guidance around understanding the market, there's incentives and so on and so forth. For someone that can't afford your services and that does it themselves, what's sort of the structure of negotiating that lease process?
Well, I think what you do is even if you find something's ideal, I would basically go back to a short list of 3 or 4 agents of properties. I mean, you've always got to have a plan B and a plan C. So I would certainly, when you get to the point where you've done all your inspections and your partners have been through the premises and you come to consensus as a business as to which premises you want, I would be going back to, say, 3 agents, including the one you selected, and asking them to put forward a written proposal as to setting out the basic heads of terms for a lease. And that will set out things like lease term, rent, incentive, rent review pattern, options, make good, things like that. And there might be works you need doing. So you get 3 letters from the respective building owners setting out the terms. You look at them, you work out what the cost is of those proposals in terms of over the term of years, and then you work out what you want out of the deal. And then you might go back to 1 or 2 of the landlords and make a counter proposal and say, look, we've made a short list, 2 or 3 properties. This is our counter offer. And if you've got a tenant rep involved, someone like myself, I'd be talking to each of them saying, come on, guys, the offer you put forward is not in line with market. You know that. Where's the bottom line? And then we can then tailor that information into any counter proposal. And there is element of going backwards and forwards and working out what is important. And one thing, like we found with your own negotiations, we were looking for a long-term lease. And the reason we wanted a long-term lease was that was going to maximize your incentive by having a longer-term lease. But some of the owners weren't prepared to go beyond 8 years, and some of them weren't prepared to provide mid-term rent reviews. So all those things have got to be taken into account when you look at what's the best deal from your perspective. So it's a bit of going back, a bit of bluff as well. And I think what happens at the end of the day, you tailor it down to maybe 2 properties or 1 property, always making sure you don't actually show your cards in terms of you do favour 1 property rather than the other. And then it comes down to the nitty-gritty in terms of working out where they won't agree and where you're prepared to agree and what is important. I think at the end of the day, you've got to make sure you get a deal that's in line with what we feel to be market and what's right.
Let's talk about incentive. You've used that word a few times. So define what is an incentive.
Yeah. So as we talked about rental levels, and they have increased slightly over 5 years, but not significantly. They've probably gone backwards. So when you're looking at effective rents, an effective rent is when you take the face rent, you take the incentive out of it to work out what the actual rent is you're paying at the end of the day. So the incentive landlords, rather than reduce their face rents, which will affect the capital value of the property, they'll provide you with a market incentive. And the market incentive is provided in the form of they might give you a fit out, capital lump sum, or a rent free period, or rent abatement, which is they take the lump sum of the incentive and that's paid to you over the term of the lease. But the incentive is really to bring the rent back to what's an effective rent for the market, because most landlords want to maintain their capital value, they want to maintain their face rent. So they'll provide you with an incentive rather than reduce the rent and the capital value of their property at the end of the day. It's their incentives have been around for many years now, and maybe they'll certainly continue, particularly in light of what's happening in the market at the moment, where because tenants nowadays are not taking so much space, demand for space is less, vacancy rates have increased. So landlords have to provide these incentives to encourage tenants to come to their property. The incentive a landlord will provide will very much depend upon their own particular building in terms of what their lease expiry profile looks like and how many tenants they've got in the building. So incentives can vary considerably dependent on the landlord and the building. And you find, particularly with B grade buildings nowadays, which are not so popular because this flight to quality, that the incentives that are being offered there are substantial. And that's because a lot of tenants don't want to go into a B grade building these days.
What was sort of the norm pre-COVID in terms of office incentives?
Prior to COVID, and this is quite a generalization because it does vary from building to building, but in the suburbs, incentives were 15 to 20%. After COVID, they were moving out anything between 30 and 40%. So in the city where vacancy rates were higher, you're getting incentives over 40% COVID. And that's quantum of incentives has been affected by the vacancy rate. We have got a very high vacancy rate now. Pre-COVID, we were talking well down to 6-7%. Now I believe it's something like 13 to 15%. Hence, there's a correlation between the incentive and the vacancy rate, and that there's a further correlation between individual buildings and their the amount of vacancy you have in those particular buildings. And the incentive, just to go back to the incentive is basically calculated on the lease term, number of years your lease. And so if there's an incentive of 20%, your incentive will be calculated as your first year's rent times the number of years of your lease. And then that incentive of 20% or 30% will be applied to that. So obviously, if you go longer term, you get a bigger incentive, but that does mean locking into a longer term lease. And a lot of businesses don't want to do that because they don't know what they're going to be doing next year, let alone in 5 or 10 years.
Now we talked about understanding the market, what does the market doing, and really knowing that before you go out there heavily negotiating. For those that don't again have the ability to request your services or do this on their own, leasing and understanding leasing and pricing and what's happening in the market, what are the tools available to people to do that and how do they actually learn what the market is doing?
I think it's really talking to real estate agents. If you ring up JLL or Colliers or CBRE and talk to one of the guys in the leasing department, they will be very, very helpful. They will give you a lot of information. So if you want to find out what's happening in the market, pick the phone up and talk to, it might be a local real estate agent who specializes in office leasing, Kelly and Kelly or Gorman and Kelly or someone like that. The agents there, they all want to be your best friend and they all want to provide you as much information as they can. And if they can, they will try and hold your hand through the whole process. So they don't want you to have advice at the end of the day. They want to control you. And there's a lot of agents out there who will broker a deal for you. So they will say, Alexander Spencer, don't worry about employing a tenant rep. I'll look after your interests. I'll go out to the market. I'll do the sourcing of the property and I'll do the negotiations. And it's not going to cost you anything. The landlord will pay my fees. And to a lot of people, that sounds, well, that's fantastic. Go ahead and do it. But what you don't realize at the end of the day is when you broker a deal, the agent acting or you're working with, he's getting paid by the landlord. And any fee that's being paid to the broker is coming out of your incentive. So it's smoke and mirrors, really. And the other thing you've got to realise, he's not acting in your best interest at the end of the day. He just wants to do a deal. And you also got to recognise, and I've been on the other side of the fence as an agent, where a tenant rep will come to me and say, I'm acting for this company, provide me the details of what you've got on your list. I give them the information, and the broker, in one instance, the broker came back to me and said, thanks for the information. If you want me to bring this tenant to your property, I want you to pay me 15% commission, or your client, which would be grossly inflated. If you don't do that, I'm not going to do it, which is not very ethical. It's not acting in your client's best interest, and it's deceitful, I think. The agents got wise to this process. So when they provided heads of terms to tenants or their broker, they would say, well, the incentive's this, and the amount I'm paying your broker's this, and it's coming out of your incentive. A lot of brokers didn't like that. There's a lot of agents out there who'd be quite happy to broker a deal for you. They won't charge you a fee, but what you've got to recognise, they're not acting in your best interests. They're not probably going to point out things like the rent review patterns higher than it should be. They're not going to point out that the market review provisions aren't acceptable. So you're not really doing yourself a service by going down that road. And what you've got to remember, taking on a lease commitment is like taking on staff. If you get a club member of staff, it's going to cost you a lot of money at the end of the day. And it's a bit like taking on a property. If you can buy yourself into a lot of problems. So getting back to your question, how can your clients move forward in the negotiations in this process without getting someone like me on board? There's a lot of information out there that agents are prepared to give you. But I also think that when it comes to the end of negotiations, you can get other people to come in, like designers, and who will pick out faults with the building, issues that can be raised in future negotiations. So a lot of people do it, go out and do their own negotiations and do it successfully, but it's that 1 in 10 that go wrong. When it does go wrong, it can be a nightmare. So you want to try and minimise that risk, if you can.
Now, I want to talk about renewing a lease, Chris, because a lot of people forget that when their initial term is up and they have the option to renew, the way that it generally works is it goes to market review and blah, blah, blah. I feel like most of my clients that have gone through this process and I've spoken to them, they just think, oh, yeah, just another renewal and I can just, whatever the rent was, it's fine. And they just proceed like it's just an extension like the prior one was. However, the opportunity there is to renegotiate. You could potentially get more incentive. You can go to market to see what else is out there. And I feel like a lot of our clients miss that opportunity at the term renewal, especially when the option to renew in general terms is at the tenant's discretion. Can you talk us about some of the opportunities Australian businesses have when negotiating a lease renewal? And what are some of the things you can do differently that is at the renewal phase that you would maybe do differently when you're negotiating the big term of the lease, the original one?
Well, I think element of competition, and I think with anyone thinking about renewing a lease, it comes down to negotiations. I think it's important you make it clear to the landlord that you don't know what you're going to do. You're looking at your options. The last thing you want to say is, we want to renew our lease. and they know you're captive and you're not going anywhere. So it doesn't help you in your negotiations. So number one, that is, if you do want to renew, don't tell your landlord. And also, the other thing is, don't tell your staff. I'm not trying to say you're being deceitful here, but what happens is one of your staff members says to the director, "Oh, I see we're renewing or we're relocating," and the director says, "Oh, we're staying. We're not going anywhere." And Joe Blow gets in the lift, and the caretaker's in the lift, and so you keep your cards close to your chest. So leases, say you've got a 5-year lease, a lot of leases will have an option for a further term. So one of the things you've got to think about is whether you want to exercise that option or not. And you'll normally find you have to exercise that option 6 to 9 months prior to the lease expiry date. So before that, what I would be saying to tenants is it's probably better if you can go and negotiate a new lease rather than exercise the option, because it creates some degree of certainty as to whether you're going to get the deal you want, you get the right terms, you get the incentive. With a lot of options, people exercise the option and the landlord doesn't have to provide new terms normally until the commencement of the further term. And the lease provides an arbitration process if you don't agree with the terms. However, you've got to look very carefully at the lease, because you might exercise the option and you might find that the review provision has what we call a ratchet clause in there. So it talks about open market. You might say, "Oh, well, I'll just exercise the option, it goes open market," but you don't realise there's a ratchet. So your rent can't go backwards. And also, you don't benefit from any incentive that might be offered in the marketplace. So it's important that, I think, if you have got an option, if you can negotiate a new lease prior to the date that you have to exercise the option, that is the way forward, rather than having that uncertainty as to what the rent for the further term is going to be. Unless in your lease it's very prescriptive and it sets out exactly what it is, and then you've got a fairly good idea what it is. Some landlords won't let you in when you're negotiating a new lease for renewal. Review provisions won't let you. They will insist on a ratchet clause where the rent can't go down, and sometimes they'll say you've got to disregard market incentives as well. So those are things you've got to look at when you're thinking about either exercising or negotiating a new lease. Yeah, and also when you've got a renewal, you've got one and only chance at that point in time to also, you should have a little bit of a shopping list about other things that you might not be happy with building, like the air conditioning hasn't been working properly. Well, I need an assurance that's going to be fixed. I think the reception looks awful. What are you going to do about that? So there's other things apart from rent and incentive that you can bring into those discussions at the time of the renewal, which if you just exercise your option, that's it. It's just down to a rental negotiation, and depending on what it says in your lease, that's going to determine what you end up with. But a lot of tenants aren't happy with some of the services at that point in time. So if they go and start negotiating earlier on, they can get an assurance from the landlord they're going to fix all these sort of things. So a renewal is not always just about rent. It might be about other things that are important to you.
Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about very, very quickly, we mentioned make good. I was shocked in our negotiations that you could actually eliminate that if you renew a further term. So I'll be quite open with the audience here today, when we renegotiated our lease together, if we were to renew our first option for a further term, we would eliminate the need for a make good. And that was already negotiated initially. And I'm like, that's so good, Chris. I would never knew that you could even do things like that. So with the make good, obviously make good is bringing the premises back to what you went into it as, and that could be quite costly. What are the ways to do that? Is the best strategy to eliminate make good to put that at the start of the lease that if we extend it beyond our first term, we're not going to make good. So therefore, eliminating that cost. Any other tips that you have for that?
Well, at the end of the day, depends what your lease says about make good. If you take an existing fit out, then you really shouldn't be making good. You should just be walking out, leaving it clean and tidy. A make good these days could cost you anything from $2 to $350, $350 per square meter. So it's expensive, and a lot of businesses forget about that when they're moving, and they forget that they've got to make good where they are, and they've got that, and then they've got their fit out costs, and so it can be quite costly. I think because of the state of the market at the moment, and it is a tenants market, that it has become fairly standard practice with longer term leases whereby you can negotiate out the make good provisions. So landlords have been happy to do that. Not all landlords will do it. Some will not be prepared to do it. But I think the landlord has to recognise in the longer term leases, at the end of the lease, they're probably going to have to substantially refurbish space anyway. It's, they're not too concerned about it. It's something they'll write off in the long term. However, it can be an absolute minefield. And with a lot of leases, you've got to make good. Landlords, when your lease is coming in, will get a chartered surveyor in to assess the make good. And a lot of in B and A grade buildings, most cases, this is what they'll do. They'll get someone in to come in and do a schedule of make good, and they'll cost it. And they'll throw that at the tenant, says, well, your obligation is to make good. A lot of landlords, what they'll do is there'll be a negotiation, and the landlord say, well, you pay us X and you can just walk away. What you'll find is they'll get professional firms to provide these makers, and the costs they'll come up with always exceeds what the actual costs, throwing all sorts of fees and they overestimate. So there is a negotiation to be had there. But a lot of landlords like to negotiate a settlement, make good, a cash payout, and then they've got the fit out and they've got the cash. And then they can try and lease it and pocket the make good. But so I think from a tenant's point of view, if you've got to get involved with a make good, it's a huge distraction, because if you have got a make good and you're going to do it yourself, and you decide the landlord's being unreasonable about the amount of money they want for a settlement, you have actually got to move out the premises a month to 2 months prior to the lease expires, so you can get someone in to do those works yourself. There's a cost itself, and you're doubling up on rent. So if you can get away with that, do a cash settlement is probably the better way to go. But you certainly got to look at those figures, and the landlord will provide you with a schedule. There's a lot of fat in there that can be cut out. You've got to be careful when you're entering to lease what your obligations are at the end, and if you can negotiate out of that, all well and good. But you need to minimise other things, like some landlords will insist on you making good everything within the ceiling space. So it means reinstating the air conditioning ducting to what was originally the base building. So if you can negotiate and make good below ceiling and forget about having to go into the ceiling, and so that is fairly common in a lot of negotiations. You'll try and negotiate make good below ceiling, so you don't have to go into the ceiling, reinstate air conditioning and lighting and things like that. But it's another speciality in the commercial world that people get involved with, and it can get very complex and very expensive as well.
It definitely gets complex. I'm so glad we hired you to do what we did for us. There's so many moving parts. I think also what I'm hearing, because of the moving parts and the complexities, if you don't have a tenant rep, and I think the real estate agent knows that and the landlord knows that, there's a lot of, sneaky little things they can do that you didn't even know about. And I know that you'd always get a better result with the tenant rep. I'm grateful for the services you've provided to us, Chris. I can't wait to show you our new premises that you've been a big part of getting for our firm. And thank you so much for helping our business community in joining me on the bottom line today. So I want to say Thank you so, so much. You've been amazing for us, amazing to our listeners today. And over the 12-year journey, I know that you've got so many people, such great deals in the office space. And I want to say thank you for the services you provide. And I wish you all the best in everything you do post your business, and can't wait to show you the new office. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
This is The Bottom Line, a show designed to help Australian businesses succeed. This podcast was produced by accountancy firm Alexander Spencer. At Alexander Spencer, we've been helping business owners realise their goals since 1952, and we play a pivotal role in developing, implementing, and supervising the business goals and strategies of our clients. To find out how we can help your business succeed, head to our website, alexanderspencer.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of The Bottom Line, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Savan Tuna, and we'll be back next episode with more tips to help you transform your business. And that's The Bottom Line.